So the first question that I wanted to ask to get us started was to ask you about the JWs who came to Dr. Bahnsen, since you mentioned that in your talk.
Yeah. So we're okay with audio? Oh,
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, so that was illustrative of his sense of humor and his playfulness. He had a study upstairs in his home in Orange County, and he would work there during the day. His sons were gone off to school and so forth, and one day comes a knock on the door, and he leans out the upstairs window, and there's two Jehovah's Witnesses knocking on the door, and he hollered at them, and they wanted to talk to him, the usual spiel. And he said, well, I would love to come downstairs and talk to you, but I have a problem. Oh, yes? What's that? Well, whenever you come to my house and I come down and I talk to you, you never stay around very long. Oh, we're sorry about that. So this lengthy back and forth about, do you promise me that you will stay? Oh, yes, we'll stay. And you'll answer my questions? Oh, yes, we'll answer your questions. So he finally goes downstairs and he lets them in. And they sit in the living room. And as you can imagine, the conversation begins to unfold. And pretty soon they're looking at their watches and trying to figure out how they're going to He said, you're not thinking about leaving, are you? Oh, no, we're not going to leave. It goes on a little bit more. And they're, well, we have some other streets to cover, you're getting ready to leave, aren't you? Well, and finally they went out, and he had a good chuckle about that. So that was the point of the JWs at the door.
Very good. This is a question for Dr. Strange. Since both Revelation and creation point to God, is there not a possible collaboration between presuppositionalists and the evidentialists, realizing, of course, that all facts require interpretation?
Well, the problem with evidentialists, I think I'm on. The problem with evidentialists is they're partisans of evidentialism. The problem with rationalists, as I was describing them, is they're partisans of rationalism. And both evidentialism and rationalism have problems because they assume the autonomy of their enterprises. If you're talking about the use of our reason, we use our reason all the time, and properly so. It's a gift of God, and it reflects the God who is there. We talk about logic and all these things. This is reflective of the character of God. And so we use reason, but we use, as believers, we have what we call, and the scholars refer to it and make a distinction here, the ministerial use of reason. We use reason, we're servants, and we're under the Word of God. We don't magisterially use reason, which is how the unbeliever uses it. He's over the Word of God, or to put it the way Lewis puts it, I think very helpfully, we see ourselves as on the bench. We're the judge, and God stands before us as the prisoner. God stands before us to be judged by us, but He never does that. We're always before God to be judged by Him. So rationalism or classicism grants an autonomy to our reason. It grants an autonomy to our use of empirical evidences. We use and can use the presuppositional approach goes down to the very roots. It's radical. It goes down to the roots of everything. Greg would say, as he said in the Stein debate, he doesn't believe in God contra the evidence. He believes in God in keeping with the evidence. But it's done as Augustine. This is really Augustinian. Faith must precede reasoning. We must believe in order to understand. So you've got to get these things right. And that's just what the evidentialist, the empiricist, evidentialist, and the rationalist don't get right. They're not getting right that a ministerial use of reason is in play. Or you can think of, for example, Tom Notaro is a great little book by P&R called, the last time I said it, students said it was...
Van Til's use of evidence.
Yeah, Van Til's use of evidence, but what I was going to say is that the students said it was hundreds of dollars. So you know how that is. You look up things on Amazon.
Page, yeah.
And I told them, I said, I have a volume. They said it was $800. I said, I'll sell you mine for $500. So yeah, I'm big-hearted that way with the students. But no, so at any rate, yeah. Tom Notaro's book, Van Til's Use of Evidence, and it's very clear there. Of course, we use evidence. Of course, we use our reason. But we do it all in submission to and under God.
Van Til had that syllabus himself.
That's
on
right.
Christian theistic
evidences. Right,
So,
right. But in the way Greg would often talk about this is what's at the center are our commitments, our most basic presuppositions. He would often talk about spider's web. And it's as you go out, that's where the evidences come in, so to speak. So you could do this and not destroy a spider's web, but he's going for the evidences don't get to the heart of matters. And Greg is always going for the heart. And the heart are one's faith commitment. And that's reflected in your presuppositions.
Very good. After asking this question, I'm going to see if I can pick up any other questions, if there's any out there. But to Pastor Wagner, question here says, to what extent were the controversies in Bahnsen's life about content versus style?
Content versus style. I would say mostly content. But there again, and I'm not accusing other people of things that we're not all guilty of. If you're losing a content battle, it's easier to attack style. And it's just an evasion. And so, you think about debates over, because there were some, we've talked about different debates. There was a debate between Greg and R.C. Sproul over apologetic method. They were good faith debaters, and there was a lot of light that came out of that exchange. And I think a lot of people saw that fundamentally there may not be as much difference as there appeared to be on a rhetorical level. So there they were grappling with content, and they were both behaving themselves. In some of the things that I alluded to, and I can't confirm all of this, but there was a backstory, particularly to the things that happened in the Southern California world. Even while Greg was coming up through high school, he was involved in youth groups, he was involved in summer camps, he tangled with some important people over issues, and I think the issues were important and clear-cut, but the person who's right isn't always the one who has the most persuasive clout. So, and that just kind of snowballed. So by the time he came to the presbytery after he was done at seminary, ready to get licensed and ordained, I alluded to that issue. There was already a lot of personal animosity. But again, you're not going to say, I hate you. So what are you going to say? Well, I disagree with, and you make it an issue over content. And if you don't win the argument over content, then you attack the style. I mean, if you've listened to the tapes, even the debates, and those of us who did know him and saw him in action, I won't say he never, well, I could almost say I don't ever remember him taking an unfair advantage on the level of style when the content wasn't set, stable. I'm sort of rambling. I'm not giving a very good answer there. But I think usually the issues were substantive, but if you don't win the argument on that level, you either have to say, I was wrong and I'm going to think differently, or you have to say, I don't like the way you packaged that. And those harsh, unloving, legalistic, judgmental, those kind of accusations, they were all aimed at style, but his manner just was not that way.
This is a question, I think, for Dr. Strange, because he mentioned it in his talk. What was the aftermath of the Stein debate?
You might know that better than I do.
No, I think he might have.
Yeah.
Well, at least I will.
I'll say this. What happened, and I'm not sure. You might can fill in some blanks here, but Greg and I talked about a number of things. One of the things this is a little different, then I'll go back and answer that. But he did talk about, I knew him for just a few years towards the end of his life. The way we got to know each other is interesting because it was some of the stuff coming out of what had happened with Kathy and all, and stuff had come to the General Assembly. And I was my first General Assembly, and I was put on the appeals and complaints, and kind of a young brash guy. Maybe he could relate to each other. But he actually heard that there was this guy who was really insisting on fairness and equity, and that was me. And he really appreciated that. And he personally contacted me. And he said, some people have told me that, I got a better shake on some things. I think things went a little more fairly on this than could have. And we don't know each other, but that led us to get to know each other, because he really appreciated that I was just saying we need to be fair here. I sensed that there were kinds of animosities and personalities, and I wasn't interested in that. I wanted to do what the case was supposed to do. But with respect to this, with respect to late life, this is where I was first going. This was this was a conversation we had in November of '95. So our area, he did the last big conference out of Southern California in our area. I was involved with that, and then he's preached in our church. It was a huge conference. We were able to get a lot of people out. And we were talking, and he was, I know the stuff he had done with Joe Morecraft about language and speech, and he was very reflective, and he was a very self-examining fellow and repentant fellow. And he talked about some things that he would have done less. He said he probably would have spent more time on, he said, the theonomy thing and just the way that, he said, I would have probably spent less time on that and more on eschatology and apologetics. It was just interesting how he was kind of, sizing things up. But with regard to this, I'm not trying to keep away from it. I just wanted to say that. I found him to be in his dealings with me, he was gracious and humble, and we differed. We had real differences in a number of areas, and I had people say, well, you can't differ with him. And I go, well, that's not my experience. I differed with him, and we lovingly argued about certain things. We had some real polity. He was a 2-office man. I'm not a 2-office. I'm a 3-office man. And we had fun arguments about that. And the most fun thing was I told him, because you really have to start in the Old Testament. I said, Greg, because he kept quoting, the pastorals. And I said, the problem here when it comes to office is you're a dispensationalist. You're not properly rooting this. And he thought that was hilarious. He said, nobody's ever called me. He thought that was just hilarious that I called him a dispensationalist on that point. But we had a lot of fun about that. But you could do that. You could have fun with him. But what happened was somebody reported to Greg, a friend, that he had read Gordon Stein's newsletter. So Gordon Stein had the debate, and 6 weeks, 2 months later, his newsletter comes out, and he reports on it. So Gordon Stein is telling his followers about the debate. And he says, I had this debate with this theist, and I really whooped up on him. And, and so Greg's, friend gets a hold of this and shows it to Greg. And so he writes Stein and says, excuse me, what debate are you referring to? We were in a debate. That didn't happen in our debate. And so it was clear that Stein still didn't understand what happened in the debate. He didn't know what had really happened. So he and Greg proceeded to have an exchange of letters. And Greg was very good. I mean, this is a brilliant guy as a scientist, but not as a philosopher or as a debater of this matter. And he explained to him how you can't, consistent with a materialistic, atheistic, naturalistic worldview, balance your checkbook. He took that as a point. You can't do it consistent with this worldview. And they had a number of letters back and forth to where Gordon Stein finally came to actually see that. And he said, I understand what you're saying, and consistent with my worldview and my approach and my beliefs, I can't balance my checkbook, but I do. And Greg said, can I publish these? And he said, I'll sue you.
I remember that now that you mention it.
Greg said, can I publish the letters? Because you've conceded the whole thing. Because you conceded with all of your fulmination that your worldview is irrational. It's just dissolved.
And Stein died not so long after that.
Yeah.
The only thing I'd add about the Stein debate is, and you don't get this on the tape because you're not there to see the faces and the body language, but Stein had debated a number of Christian apologists of one caliber or another, just shoot them up, but they were almost all either rationalistic or evidentialist. And so he was kind of ready for the 5 arguments for the existence of God and so forth. And as you hear on the tape, Greg starts out by saying, I will agree with Dr. Stein in denying the existence of any other God except the God of the Bible. Well, you could almost see Stein's face fall, and although he didn't do it, you could imagine him saying, well, that argument's out and that argument's out, because Greg just did an end run around him and, came at it from a way that Stein hadn't heard the faith defended that way ever in any of his debates. And but it was just sort of seeing the crestfallen look on Stein's face as he realized that Greg had already taken all of the cards out of his hands, and the debate was hardly underway. So that was amusing, but you had to see it.
And he
had to be there.
And he hadn't taken the trouble, because he figured he could whip him with one hand tied behind his back. So he hadn't taken the trouble to look into what Greg was really going to argue. Right. And, this is Van Tillian. Well, I don't know what that is. And to look into that and to, Yeah. Because this fellow Grace that I said was graceless and wouldn't. We had our group. He had some group that of like scientists united against faith or something on campus that was like that. That he was their sponsor, and I was sponsor for Student Bible Ministry. And we had this kind of debate, and he and I got into it a little bit. And I heard him at the break, and he was talking to this radical feminist, or I'm not sure if it was a man or a woman, but and this was back in the day, but it was a university. So the university has just come into the mainstream of American life. That's what's happened. It's been the universities. But he said he said, I've read about this. He mentioned this, and he mentioned Bahnsen. They called it a presuppositional argument. I heard this. I was getting coffee, and he said, it's very hard to argue against. And I'm just like, yes. Would you care to step up to the mic and say that?
All right, so I see that we're getting close to the hour, and so just one more question I think that we have time for. The question here says, who stands in the Van Til Bahnsen stream today as their heirs? And then a couple connected questions. Jeff Durbin, or does he not count because he's Baptist? And then what happened to the study center?
The answer to the second question was that after Greg died, the study center was Bahnsen's ministry. And although we had spun off a few things, kind of like what the Institute is trying to do now, we maintained it for a couple of years, but it was really obvious that there wasn't a person who could, in that sense, fill Greg's shoes, both in terms of competence, but also in terms of name recognition, and so it just became really unfeasible. I was on the board of the study center through all that time, and eventually we just decided that we would conclude the ministry. I don't, you're the professor of apologetics. I don't really know that there's anybody out there yet that has the combination that Greg had. That's the thing. There's Randy Booth said at Greg's memorial service, he said, you will say, who will fill Greg's shoes? And Randy's answer was, nobody. And then he said, all of us have to fill Greg's shoes. And, I think there will be other apologists. The problem is things just get more and more fragmented. So somebody might be really good in this area, but then he's got a whole lot of baggage over here. Bahnsen had plenty of baggage, but it's just gotten worse instead of better. We're not very good at listening to people that we disagree with. Even if our disagreement is fairly minor, we tend to erase. We have our own version of cancel culture. So I don't really know. In terms of maybe academic excellence and clout, do you know someone who approximates a Bahnsen at this time, in this generation?
Yeah, I guess I don't actually need this.
I just want to do that.
I know. I want to get my open Bible. I can do the Swaggart thing. I don't. I think you're right, Roger, in terms of a combination, because I don't know anyone who combines his intellectual capacity and gifts, his philosophical understanding and biblical understanding, and coming from a solid confessional viewpoint. I mean, it's sort of the theological, the philosophical, and then the popular, able to take this without. He really was very good, in my view, at reaching, to use the very memorable title of Marvedon, which is what we all, I think, in our best try to do, reach out without dumbing down. He was really good at reaching out without dumbing down, and that's a huge challenge. I mean, there are people. I mean, I think the recent book on Van Til on the Trinitarian aspects by Lane Tipton, it's got a lot of great stuff in it. I think Lane is doing good work. I think James Anderson at Reformed Seminary has got a lot of good stuff. But it's partitive. Greg was more Renaissance, a more Renaissance sort of fellow. And God does as he wills. And this is true throughout the whole history of the church. I mean, nobody exactly replaced Calvin. There are all kinds of figures. Nobody ever replaced Machen in the OPC, in a sense. You know what I mean? And so I think that's a fundamentally, I say this I'm introduced as a professor of apologetics. That's sort of my second level. I'm chiefly a historian. And as a historian, and people say things like history repeats itself. Well, patterns in history recur. History never repeats itself because it's we believe in a linear view, not a cyclical view, unless you're an Eastern pantheist heretic of some kind. We don't believe in a cyclical view of history. We believe that history we're moving towards a telos, an eschaton. And so, we really shouldn't look for. It's a fundamentally, now I'm speaking as a historian, it's a fundamentally misguided task to say, this person had all this, who precisely replaces him? Well, I think Randy's right. He doesn't have a precise replacement, but that's true throughout history, that's never been the case. But there's a whole movement, and if anybody wouldn't like Calvin Calvin would die a million deaths if he knew people. He'd be fine with reform, but he would not want you to be called a Calvinist. Where's he buried? He refused to have his grave marked because he knows people are idolaters. Our minds are idol factories, sort of like John who says, little children, keep yourself from idols, So we don't need the Bahnsen Institute, and every one of us needs to be faithful to our. I would say let's stop looking. Now I preach. Stop looking to other people to do it for you.
Well, and if he was successful in taking it to the streets, then he's equipping people. That's right. And it does occur to me, even as we're talking about this, the fact that he was largely excluded from the institutions forced him out into the streets in a way, people always say, well, wouldn't it have been great if Greg could have succeeded Van Til at Westminster Seminary? Well, maybe yes, maybe no, but if he'd gotten funneled into an academic career, he might have published lots of books, but he probably wouldn't have preached to all of those people on all of those different topics on such a popular level. So again, God doesn't make mistakes, and even if we could regret the way certain things happen, God meant it for good. And so we have all this material that the Bahnsen Institute, Bahnsen Project was trying to get out there for free, and we'll continue to do that. But, maybe the lion's share of that would not have happened if he'd niched into an institutional setting and become an academic apologist rather than a street preacher apologist.